three very distinguished guests in this table this afternoon with us. I will very briefly give you the timing of this table, and then someone will present someone who doesn't need any presentation, but someone will introduce Mr. Ralph Nader. And I will be with you during the whole time, so I will give you very briefly the timing. First, it will be Mr. Ralph Nader's turn, and he will be presented and introduced by Matthew Tawiski, a member of his office. Then it will be Mr. Pineda's, the Spanish President's turn, and then his speech, fully in Spanish, will be translated by his son, the second generation, Mr. Pineda, Mr. Luis Pineda, in this case. Con su permiso, voy a pasar a mi lengua materna, que es el español. Hay traducción simultánea para aquellos que no hablan español y al revés para aquellos que no hablan inglés. Bueno, como les decía, me cabe el honor de presentar muy brevemente esta primera mesa con tres figuras importantísimas del consumo, el doctor Ralph Nader, el doctor Luis Pineda, presidente global, y el doctor Ariel Armel Arenas, presidente de la Confederación Colombiana de Consumidores. Sin más preámbulos, vamos a empezar con esta primera conferencia y le cedo la palabra a Mr. Matthew Tawiski, organizador de la oficina de Mr. Ralph Nader. Muchas gracias.
Named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century, and by Atlantic magazine as one of the most influential Americans in American history, Ralph Nader has tirelessly given his life forging for justice for the people, for the consumer. He was born in Winston, Connecticut, to Lebanese parents, and his parents grew up in a mill town in Winston, Connecticut. He went to school at Princeton University and Harvard Law School. He used his senior thesis in law school to expose the unknown and underreported safety problems in General Motors' vehicles, which became his exploratory book, Unsafe Any Speed. Through that work, GM spied on him, and he used that opportunity to expose not just auto safety problems with cars, which brought about seatbelts, but also going into coal mine safety, occupational health and safety, Environmental Protection Agency, consumer freedom, OSHA, the U.S. acts for more transparency in the government. And he has formed hundreds of organizations locally, nationally, and has been a presence throughout the world promoting consumer protection. Not thinking that was enough, in 2000 he ran for president with the Green Party, and subsequently in 2004 and 2008 to give more voice in America in the electoral arena to the consumer. And he's trying to continuously push for more protections for people, not only here, but across the world. So it's very apt to have him here keynoting Offset's conference. He's also hosted Saturday Night Live and saying consumer advocate is a person in your neighborhood on Sesame Street. So he's tried many avenues to reach out to the youth and also people who aren't very active politically. Audiences who listen to Mr. Nader at his talks say his words and preparations speak to them, and many times it changes their lives. So it's very appropriate you have him here today. And let's introduce Mr. Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, Matthew, Pineda, Mr. Garcia. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to describe the gravity of consumer issues because in most cultures, the focus of the economy is on the selling side. It's on corporations, it's on capital, it's on labor, it's on sales, it's on profits. Just read the business press and you'll see what I mean. It is not on the buying side. And Adam Smith once said, the end of all production is consumption. And if we develop a powerful movement where you have buyer side, consumer side sovereignty, the entire economy changes. And I'll give you some examples momentarily. But it's exactly 60 years ago, 1962, 50 years ago, John F. Kennedy sent a message to the U.S. Congress as President of the United States. It was a very detailed message on 4 major consumer rights: the right to safety, the right to choice, the right to be heard, the rights that now are the structure of a great deal of the legislation that was passed after 1962. The Senate, this is how long it is. You can see it's numerous pages. It's very detailed. It goes into banking and drugs and automobiles and transportation. And it was delivered March 15, 1962. It's 50 years ago. And not a single president after President Kennedy has ever done the same thing. That alone tells you, along with other evidence, the enormous power of corporations over our government. Because obviously there are more consumers than there are sellers. There are more consumers than there are corporations. And the market is for consumers, first and foremost. But no other president has felt it appropriate for his political future to send a major message to Congress recommending consumer protection legislation. He started out with some fundamental rights. They're not comprehensive. They're rather general, as I mentioned. The right to safety, the right to be informed about what you're buying, the right to choose, that means more competition, and the right to be heard, that means when you have complaints, you can go to court, or you can be heard by a regulatory agency. Now, I've always believed that consumer issues have been deliberately downplayed in our political system precisely because they're the most important. Anything that is very important for the people is usually downplayed by a corrupt political system or a commercialized media or an indentured academy and university. Now, here you have Dade County Community College. It's huge. It's one of the biggest in the country. It's over 140,000, I guess, students. But right here, it's many, many thousands. And there are courses on business management, on marketing, on advertising, all kinds of courses to teach students how to sell when they get out and get a job. But I'll bet you there are very few courses on teaching students how to buy. And if they know how to buy, and then they go into the business world and start selling, they're going to have more respect for the consumer, and they're going to push for a higher level of commercial integrity. But it's the same all over the country. There are courses on selling and very few courses on buying. If we had a consumer sovereign economy, we would have a completely different kind of economy. Let me give you some examples. In the 1930s, early 1930s, perhaps 1920s, Alva Edison, Henry Ford, and the heads of MIT and Harvard together recommended that our economy go for renewable energy. They basically said, that anything you can get out of hydrocarbons to burn, like coal and oil, you can get out of carbohydrates, like plant life or sunlight, producing plant life. Had we gone in that direction, we would not have a solarized economy, we would not have coal air pollution, we would not have tens of thousands of people dying, we would have a more self-reliant economy, a more decentralized economy, solar panels, for example, instead of nuclear plants, instead of deadly coal mines. Instead, we went full-fledged fossil fuels and nuclear power. And what made that happen was the chemical industry, which began to expand DuPont, Dow Chemical, Hooker Chemical, and others in the 1930s. So we went hydrocarbon instead of carbohydrates. Now that is the example of a direction that favored gigantic corporate sellers, the oil companies, the coal companies, gas companies, nuclear companies, and disfavored the tens of millions of consumers. Because they had to pay more, they suffered, they got sick, they died, they became dependent on foreign sources of oil. The net negatives are enormous. That's what happens when you have a seller sovereign economy instead of a consumer sovereign economy. But there are many other good examples. For instance, and I'll give you two successes and two failures. The first success was 60 years after the automobile proliferated all over the country. There started to be a movement to make automobiles less polluting and safer. And automobiles today, because of federal regulation and mandatory standards, are far safer than they were 40, 50 years ago, far more fuel efficient, not as much as they should be. But in 1974, the average fuel efficiency of General Motors cars was 13 miles a gallon. It should be now 50, 60 miles a gallon, but it's now about double, around 26 miles per gallon. This movement basically was started by a very small number of people, including me, 3 or 4 engineers who had experience in the auto industry and had left it, a small number of doctors who were interested in preventing trauma by having safer automobiles, seat belts, airbags, padded dash panels, collapsing steering columns, stronger door latches, rollover support. And they began contacting members of Congress, about 5 good reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Detroit News, Associated Press, UPI, covered it regularly, the battle in Congress to regulate the auto companies. And we won, and President Lyndon Johnson signed it into law in September 1966. And he regularly enforced and saved over 1 million lives in this country and forced other auto companies abroad to upgrade their safety if they wanted to sell into the United States. Now you see the sequence? Small number of people, equipped with good knowledge, strategy, congressional power, White House power, media reporters, and in 9 months, after Unsafe at Any Speed came out, my book, 9 months, the largest industry in the country was regulated. Can you imagine trying to do that today? The second story that's still unfolding is tobacco. I consider the resistance of the tobacco industry one of the greatest consumer victories of the century. 420,000 Americans die every year from tobacco-related diseases. About 1964, watch the sequence now of how success occurs. the Surgeon General of the U.S. government put out a report connecting tobacco smoking with cancer and succeeding reports with heart disease. The press started reporting this. Doctors started telling their patients, you know, if you want me to try to take care of you, you better stop smoking. Otherwise, you're fighting against me and your own health. The tobacco companies fought back. They hired pseudoscientists to put out reports saying there's no connection between tobacco addiction and cancer. The next step was litigation. The trial lawyers, including here in Florida, developed a number of very creative theories to bring the tobacco companies to court under the tort law system on behalf of clients or next of kin of clients who had died from lung cancer. This was brought to the attention of 60 Minutes and 2020 because the lawyers started getting internal documents from the tobacco company. And they were very incriminating. This was also brought to the attention of state attorney generals, and in a spectacular settlement, they settled for about $260 billion, and the tobacco companies were completely on the defensive. Philip Morris even asked for federal regulation of tobacco. In effect, to stay away from all these lawsuits. There now is a law that regulates tobacco content, and they're ready to put out some regulations. Along with this drive was the organization of non-smokers. Some of you remember going on planes, buses, and trains and just going like this with so much smoke. People smoking everywhere in essentially contained tubes. If you burn toast in your kitchen, you see how fast the air fills up? Well, when you're on an airplane, you're on like a tube, and it doesn't take many smokers to fill it up. So first we got a rule that said, non-smoking here, smoking passengers there. As if the smoke obeyed the barrier, but it was better than nothing. The tobacco companies fought back. They organized smoker groups who declared they had a constitutional right to blow smoke in our face. Well, a few years later, we got a rule abolishing all smoking on interstate airlines, trains, buses, and so forth. That, of course, raised the expectation level of non-smokers. And non-smokers became very demanding. So you started getting restaurants non-smoking, hospital waiting rooms non-smoking, and now you know the rest. The smokers are outside the building, trying to have a draft. This is an enormous success, and it's going to continue. The number of people smoking in 1964 in the United States, 45% smoke regularly. Now it's under 20%, about 19%. And you see the sequence. It isn't like we had 1,000 groups with 50,000 advocates. It was a whole mix of things that began raising people's expectation to say, no, I don't want my children, I don't want me to have to inhale your smoke. It turned it around. It's always important to see what are the sequences that result in victories, as well as the sequences that result in defeats. Now I'm going to talk about two defeats. One is health insurance. We're the only country in the Western world without universal health insurance. And there are some third world countries that have universal health Now, if you think that's only an economic problem, consider Harvard Medical School report in the December 2009 Journal of Public Health, which estimated, catch this, 800 Americans a week die because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated. 800 a week, 45,000 a year. That means in 1 month, more people died because they don't have health insurance than the massacre of 9/11. And it's every month. So we're talking millions of Americans who've died, tens of millions who have gotten sicker and more injured because they didn't have health insurance to get treated. They didn't die, but they got sicker and more injured. President Harry Truman recommended universal health insurance in 1946. We do not have it today. 50 million people without health insurance, another 50 million underinsured, and enormous anxiety, enormous gouging by the health insurance companies, and enormously overpriced drugs. The drug industry of the United States of America, which is subsidized by your tax dollars, called tax credits to Pfizer and Bristol Myers, which is enormously subsidized by your tax dollars supporting research and development under the National Institutes of Health. They create drugs, test them clinically on your taxpayer bill, and then give them away free to the drug companies. Like Taxol, which is an anti-cancer drug, was developed by 31 million taxpayer dollars under the National Cancer Institute, government agency. It was given away free under an exclusive marketing agreement to Bristol Myers Squibb, which in the year 2000 charged a woman who lost her job because of ovarian cancer $14,000 for 6 treatments. She had no health insurance. Bristol Myers did not discover the drug, did not test the drug, they just received it. Compliments of you, the taxpayer. To this day, the most dominant powers on health policy are no longer the doctors. It's the drug companies, the insurance companies, and the HMOs who are buying up doctor practices. And doctors are increasingly an employed profession, losing their professional independence. And so from 1946 to 2012, we do not have a system like Canada. We do not have full Medicare for everybody. We have Medicare for the elderly. We have Medicaid for some poor people. We do not have full Medicare, everybody in, nobody out, with free choice of doctor and hospital, the way they do in Canada. In Canada and Western Europe, health insurance covers everybody for half the price per capita that we spend in our country, and we don't cover everybody by a long shot. So this year, we'll spend $8,000 per capita on health care in this country. Canada spends $4,200, covers everybody. They have as high wages as we do. They look like us, but we don't have it. This is enormous failure of the consumer initiative. The health insurance companies and drug companies have hundreds and hundreds of lobbyists full-time over the House of Representatives and the Senate. They put many millions of dollars in the campaign coffers of presidential candidates and senators and representatives or their challengers, and they dominate the airwaves. There is a movement for what's called full Medicare for all, single payer. The website is singlepayeraction.org, one of them, singlepayeraction.org. We think the way to get it is what's called the checkoff. and this is a very important innovation. In Illinois and Wisconsin, when electricity rates were going up in the late 1970s, we persuaded the Illinois legislature and the Wisconsin legislature to pass a law requiring the electric companies, gas companies, water companies to put this in their billing envelope. This falls out, you open your bill, and it falls out, and it says, do you want to join your own consumer group with full-time lawyers, economists, to countervail the power of the electric, gas, and telephone company, water company. Not every month, but a couple times a year. So people say, hey, this is pretty good. Let's send $5, $10, $15, become members, elect the board of directors, they hire the full-time champion, so when the utility commission has to decide how much they're going to allow the telephone, electric, gas company to charge you, you've got champions at the table. In 18 months, 180,000 people in Illinois joined in the early 1980s. Then the Supreme Court ruled that this was unconstitutional. Some of you have heard of the Citizens United Supreme Court, corporate personhood. Imagine the Supreme Court, 5-3, ruled that this electric utility monopoly in California did not have to carry this envelope, and no expense to itself, in its billing envelope, because it had a right to stay silent and not rebut it, violated its First Amendment rights. This is why so many people now are upset about corporations having the same rights as human beings. They should be subordinated to the sovereignty of the people. Our Constitution starts, after all, with we the people, not we the corporation. The word corporation does not exist in our Constitution. The word company does not exist in our Constitution. Why are we ruled by it? Now, the nice thing about this is it's voluntary to the consumer to join or not to join. It doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. It's funded by the contribution. And if it goes out to 50, 60 million people, all you need is 500,000 or 1 million people to have a very powerful group, because they will represent the public feelings of justice of tens of millions of people who aren't going to join it for a variety of reasons. Now, the drug industry offers another illustration. We're now spending about $250 billion on pharmaceuticals. The drug industry is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, at least on paper. Ever since the thalidomide disaster in the early 1960s, when about 10,000 infants were born with flippers for hands and legs in Western Europe, the Food and Drug Administration blocked that drug from coming from Germany and other countries to the United States, just in time. Ever since that happened, there hasn't been a visible disaster from a particular pharmaceutical, but there have been a lot of invisible disasters. For example, the painkiller derived from Darvan killed thousands of people in Western Europe and the United States before our health research group blocked it and got it finally taken off the market in the last year. Vioxx is supposed to deal with heart problems. It generated heart attacks. So many drugs now are actually creating exactly the illness that they're designed to mitigate or to hold off. In this country, high blood pressure, glaucoma, pain relief, all of them approved by the Food and Drug Administration. In our group, divides them into two categories: worst pills, best pills. In other words, They're all approved to deal with the illness, but some of them have far worse side effects: gastrointestinal bleeding, chronic nausea. Those are the worst pills. The best pills have less. Now here's a little nonprofit group that is doing what the Food and Drug Administration should have done years ago, but did not. Why not? Because it's under the influence of the drug companies and their allies in Congress. For $16, you can subscribe, and anytime you are prescribed a medicine, you look it up and you see whether it's worst pills, best pills, and why. And it's extremely accurate. Doctors use it. The point here is that when you have the evidence and the data, a very small group can have a huge effect. Now, if we had a consumer sovereign economy back in the 1920s, what kind of transportation system would we have? We would have a modern public transit system. We wouldn't spend a good part of our daily lives stuck in traffic like you do here, going at a rate of speed slower than a lame horse in 1890 in Miami. We would have less pollution. We would have a different kind of propulsion engine for cars. We wouldn't have the internal combustion engine. We'd have much cleaner, more efficient. You see what we pay when we do not have a consumer sovereign economy. Have you heard the latest figure on how many people die in this country from adverse effects of pharmaceuticals prescribed by doctors? It's over 2,000 a week. 2,000 a week. Medical journals documented. Do you know how many people die from medical mistakes in hospitals every year in the United States? Again, 2,000 a week. Do you know how many people die in this country every day from hospital-induced infections because of sloppy sanitation and other mismanagement? Those figures come from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. 250 a day. 250 a day. In 15 days, it's more than 9/11. Every day. You see, these are silent forms of violence that are relatively invisible. And silent forms of violence that are traced to corporate negligence, cutting corners for profit, or corporate crime are not given any attention by our political system or our election system. Have you ever heard Obama talk about this? He talks about terror, he talks about the NCAA brackets, knows a lot about those. Have you heard Romney, Gingrich? The two parties ignore over 350,000 preventable deaths a year from occupational disease and consumer hazards and pollution. Pollution is a form of compulsory consumption. And they don't even turn it into a political issue. As a result, the regulatory agencies are very weak. They're very underfunded in their prosecution budgets. And they don't have enough laboratories or inspectors. As a result, we've lost control of our drugs. 80% of the ingredients in the pharmaceuticals that you take come from China and India. And the Food and Drug Administration is not exactly sending adequate number of inspectors of those laboratories. And tell the families of the 100 Americans who died in the operating room because they were given a blood thinner that had a contaminated ingredient that came from a laboratory in China that was never inspected by the FDA. 20 years ago, 100% of the ingredients came from the USA. Do you hear anybody talking about that? in the political system? How long are we going to rely on a two-party dictatorship? Or basically one corporate party with two heads wearing different makeup? As long as we do not, as consumers, have a sensitivity to the silent violence that is wreaking homicidal havoc and traumatic havoc and morbidity havoc throughout our country every day, we will not force the politicians to pay attention to it. You think Governor Scott is going to pay attention to this? You see what happens? If something is not discussed publicly by the political electoral system, you can be guaranteed that the political governmental system is not going to do anything about it when they're elected. Consumer economies is a very, very exciting part of the new consumer movement. By that I mean the following. 100 years ago, a group of Canadians came to New Hampshire and taught us how to set up a credit union. How many people here belong to a credit union? 75 million Americans now belong to a credit union. Now, on paper, that is a cooperative bank. 75 million. That is a great innovation, and they've done a lot of good things. They don't rip you off quite as badly as the banks. They don't engage in speculative derivatives, by and large. By and large, very few failed in 2008, 2009. The ones that did were hooked by Citibank and the other banks called the wholesale credit unions that supply services to the retail ones that you go into. Now, that is a pillar of the community economies. And if we can make credit unions more democratic, if we as members can become more assertive, they can become a real displacing force for the big commercial banks. Indeed, in the last year and a half, people have moved their money from the big commercial banks to community banks and credit unions in the billions of dollars. It's called the Move Your Money. It started out by a filmmaker, Eugene Jaricki, who took a few days off and did a 3-minute flash video. January 2011. Move your money. Well, as you know, it's much harder to move your money now than it was 50 years ago, because you've got all the electronic payments, your electric company, you've got your credit card, they got the hooks in you so many ways that a lot of people say they can't be bothered. And they end up paying penalties too, if they move their money. But enough people are beginning to say, we're going to move our money. We got hundreds of community banks, and we've got thousands of credit unions. The second pillar of the consumer, the community economy, we're not talking theory here. They're operating right now. The idea is to make them quantitatively significant. Instead of 2-3% of the economy, 3-4%, why not 10-15%. The second one is the local farm to consumer economy, the farmers markets, which have been expanded. You're seeing now wind power, solar energy of various kinds, some biomass, and efficiency, as well as cogeneration. All these are forms of energy. And every time we generate megawatts or BTUs locally through renewable energy and energy efficiency, and don't leave out geothermal for the coming years, every time we do that, we displace some sales by ExxonMobil. We displace some sales by Chesapeake Energy. We displace some sales by Peabody Coal. We displace some sales by El Paso Natural Gas. So the community economics movement, which is accessible to you, they can't run away, you know their names, you can complain to them, powerful than regulation. because they can control the regulators. I'm still for regulation, but I'm just saying they can try to control the regulators. But they cannot control where you spend your money. They can control you when you're in debt. And this is where I get my next pillar, which is to develop monetary systems that circulate locally. A great deal of the control of corporations over human beings in our country is to get them into debt, to get their database, to hook them into mortgages and other instruments which are then syndicated, transferred into derivatives, and the economy collapses and the consumer pays as a consumer, foreclosed homes. The consumer pays as a worker, 8 million unemployed after the Wall Street crash, and the consumer pays as a taxpayer to bail out Wall Street in Washington. How's that for a triple header? That's what happens when you allow yourself to be hooked into credit and debit, and they keep feeding you like alcohol. It's like a narcotic. I have never had a credit card, never had a debit card, and I will never have any card that hooks me into their system where they can invade my privacy, do all kinds of profiles, ship private information anywhere around the world to whoever wants it. We have to disentangle here, and if we're going to go into debt, let us go into debt with local credit unions and local financial institutions. It tells you what's going on in the country, what people like you are doing to build a series of community economies: food, energy, credit, and of course the big one, community health clinics. The more community health clinics there are, focusing on prevention, focusing on getting people to exercise more, eat better food, etc., the lower the sales of the drug companies, the lower the sales of Aetna, the lower the sales of the medical industrial complex. This is an extremely important part of the consumer movement. Now, we have this phenomenon called too big to fail. We now have fewer giant corporations than before the Wall Street crash who are too big to fail, because they've merged. Wachovia has been taken over, Washington Mutual has been taken over by the Big Five. We have Big Five now: Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. They now have something like 60% of all the assets. Before the crash, they had about 30%. So now they're even more too big to fail. Now, this is part of what I call the corporate state. The corporate state is when corporations control government and turn government against its own people. Franklin Delano Roosevelt warned about the corporate state. In 1938, as president, he sent a message to the Congress. And the message said, whenever government is controlled by private economic power, that's fascism. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not Mussolini. And now it's worse than ever. We study government agencies, we've exposed them, we've sued them, we know them. Now, one government agency has escaped the following assertion. Corporate lobbyists and corporate executives who have been appointed heads of these agencies, like Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, so on. Every government agency is controlled by these corporations, including the Occupational Safety and Health Agency. Under President Obama, for example, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency has been unable to issue a single safety standard. There are 58,000 people in this country, according to OSHA, who die every year from workplace-related diseases and trauma. So the corporations have blocked the main job safety agency of the United States of America from issuing a standard because they've got the White House in their pocket. And the White House has directed the head of OSHA, who's a wonderful man, equipped, competent, sense of urgency. You're not going to issue a standard. He has one on silica, which has been underway for 9 years, prepared, documented. Will not issue one. Remember, there are two kinds of consumption. Compulsory consumption of pollution, toxics, dust, chemicals, particulates, and marketplace voluntary consumption. When we go and we want to buy a product, we want to buy credit or whatever. Now, I want to talk a bit about use of courts. How many people have ever used a small claims court? Okay. Do you have a good op? Okay. Small claims courts are everywhere. This illustrates how bad our education is in consumer skills. Starting in elementary school, high school, college, graduate school, we really do not learn consumer skills. When you learn consumer skills, you learn about the economy. You learn about the economy in a much more memorable way than Economics 101 teaches you. Supply, demand curves, etc. When you learn about how to buy food, when you learn about how to buy airlines services, when you learn how to buy credit, when you learn how to buy autos, you inescapably will learn about how these industries are organized. And the reason why so few people use small claims courts is most people don't even know about it. Most people don't know they don't need lawyers. Most people don't know how simple they are. Most people don't know a lot of them are open in the evening after work. And they can be taught how to use a small claims court in 35 minutes in one class in high school. You don't even have to look at Judge Judy. You see how bad it is? Now, I had a conflict with US Air recently. And because of thunderstorms, I canceled a flight, and it was a non-refundable fee. And I canceled it in time. And they emailed my travel agency saying that I had to use that ticket in a year or they were going to confiscate it. Wait a minute. I never gave them permission to do that. Oh, yes, I did. It's in the fine print, in the contract. So I said to them, look, we have a project on fine print contracts. By the way, we're slaves when it comes to fine print contracts. You know that. It's consumer serfs, consumer servitude, consumer peonage, contract peonage, whatever you want to call it. These are all the contracts we sign. 99% of all the contracts we sign are pre-printed, standard form contracts where all the rights are usually on the side of the seller and all the obligations and risks on the side of the buyer. And now they have a provision called compulsory arbitration where they keep us from going to court. Oh, didn't you know on page 5 in microscopic, I agree to compulsory arbitration. No government in the United States can keep you from going to court, but a corporation can if they got it in the fine print. So US Air basically said, it's in the contract. I said, okay, it's in the contract. I'll see you in small claims court. They refunded the money. See, I'll see you. Why don't they want to be seen in small claims court? Because they have to hire a lawyer. It's not worth their trouble. And if they lose, it gets in the local press. James Smith defeats US Airways. So that's what you got to use. Now the companies know that they have to control access to the courts. If they don't control access to the courts, they're going to lose a lot of cases. So they go to the legislature, Tallahassee, Albany, you know, Springfield, Illinois, and Congress, and they say, reduce the rights under the tort law system. They call it tort reform. It's actually taking away rights to have adequate compensation when you're wrongfully injured. So you sue the perpetrator, you sue the manufacturer of a car that has a defect, like Toyota, and sudden acceleration. You sue the drug company that harmed you because of a side effect of a drug that they knew about and they didn't recall from the pharmacy. And so they have worked for 30 years trying to make it difficult for you to have your day in court and to sue the perpetrator who harmed you, to get money for your illness, your health expenses, medical expenses, your wage loss, your pain and suffering. And they have so dominated the propaganda here that most people in this country think that this is a litigious society. How many of you think this is, I've really biased the question now, but most people think it's, 70% of the people in this country think it's a litigious society. Well, there's a study from the University of Wisconsin Law School by Rogers, Joel Rogers, and they found that Americans sued each other in civil court more per capita in 1840 than today. Corporations sue each other all the time. That's litigious. It's hard to sue. It's very expensive to sue. Now, it's not easy to sue General Motors. Get the witnesses, evidence. They got these big law firms, endless money to delay and cost you this and cost you that. Take this audience, okay? Now, you wouldn't be here if you weren't relatively active. You don't go through life on your knees saying you can't fight General Motors. Apart from divorce lawsuits, how many of you and your family have ever filed a lawsuit in a court of law, not small claims, in a major court of law? How many? Please raise your hand. And would you look around? Would you look around? Keep your hand up. Does that look like a litigious society to you? So, this is what propaganda is all about. Now, we have to keep the doors to the courtroom open. You should never allow anybody to tell you we're too litigious. Do you know what percent of the court budget is the court budget in Florida? You take the entire budget of the state of Florida. So, some money goes to the executive branch, money goes to the legislative branch, money goes to the judicial branch. Anyone want to guess what portion of this budget of the state of Florida goes to courts? What percent? No. 2%. In other words, they make sure that the court dockets are overburdened, there's not enough money for jury trials, they fill them up with drug cases for courts of law. That's what we're supposed to be all about, a society under the rule of law. A lot of this goes back to our education. We do not teach our students how to negotiate the marketplace. They are babes in the woods when they're up against the credit card company, the insurance companies, the banks. The sellers work overtime to figure out how they're going to get more of your money under more disagreeable conditions. Here's one way they figured it out. The finance industry is doing to you now what they couldn't do in 1970s without going to jail. They got rid of the usury laws in the 1970s, state after state. Now they can charge you unlimited interest. People who take out payday loans can end up paying 400 to 500% interest. They will charge you unlimited interest on revolving credits, etc. And in 1970s, they would have gone to jail. There would have been criminal violations. So they just get rid of the crimes, right? You get rid of the crimes by repealing the criminal laws, putting money in the coffers of the lawmakers, and It's a breeze. I think what we need to do is, you don't get out of high school until you demonstrate a number of skills, right? Okay. Consumer skills are very important. They deal with health, safety, and economic well-being. And the more consumers are smart and discriminatory and determined, and they know what their rights are, and they know how to pursue their complaints, and they can demand information, the more efficient, safe, innovative, and competitive the market will be from the seller's point of view. The consumers are the disciplinarians of the sellers, far more than competitor A seller is vis-a-vis competitor B. The quality competition flows from consumer pressure, from consumer rejection, from consumer acceptance, from consumer challenge, far more than company A and company B. I once had a classmate who became head of a big auto insurance company, and he heard me on radio say that the auto insurance companies are not competitive. He calls me up. He says, "Ralph, I knew you when you were 18. Let's have lunch in Washington." So I had lunch with him, and he says, "What do you mean we're not competitive?" He's running Progressive Insurance. Progressive Insurance competing against Geico, State Farm, Allstate. I mean, we're going nuts competing with each other. I said, "But it's not the kind of competition I'm talking about. I'm not talking about competing with each other. I'm talking about competing for the consumer." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, do you give consumers comparative information so they can decide which is the cheapest auto insurance policy between State Farm, Progressive, Geico?" And it was like a revelation to him. And he actually started putting ads all over the country comparing his company insurance with the others. That is, if you fill out a certain form, he'll give you the quotes from 5 companies. That's what I mean. The competition comes from the consumer. Now we come to the children. Children are increasingly obese. They are increasingly being commercialized. Commercialization of childhood is out of control. When I was growing up, the only thing that companies sold directly to us as 8 years old, 8 and 9-year-old, was bubble gum. Now, hundreds of billions of dollars are directed, bypassing parental authority, undermining parental authority, and going straight for the 7, 8, 5, 6, 4, 10-year-olds. And what do they sell? They sell them junk food, junk drink, violent toys, violent television programming, and cosmetics for girls at age 7. And the kids are getting overweight, they're getting obese, they're getting childhood diabetes, they're getting predisposition for high blood pressure. It's an epidemic. It's scaring the heck out of the medical and public health profession. Part of it is a sedentary life. They don't exercise enough, they don't play enough intramural sports, they don't walk enough. But a big part of it is the diet. That is a major consumer issue. That is a life and death issue. And what we need to do here is, again, utilize the school systems for more physical education. Do you know that physical education is down to about 20% of the schools? They're getting rid of it year after year for a variety of reasons that don't hold up. And of course, when you have McDonald's, which is a fat pump, a fat and sugar pump into these children's stomachs, and all the other fast food companies. There is a movement now. There's a Center for Science and Public Interest. It has a great monthly newsletter called Nutrition Action, which I urge you to get. And the U.S. government is now making this a prime issue. Michelle Obama is making it an issue. But this is again an example of how the consumer movement has to keep broadening out as new bad things come to the forefront. You know, we're dealing with huge loss of life here. Tens of thousands of people and children, preventable deaths, whether by pollution or occupational hazards or lack of health insurance or product defects and so on. I want to end on this note. Unless we organize consumers for auto insurance, banding together, show you this group in Illinois got a $1.3 billion refund from the utility, Commonwealth Edison, without even suing for overcharging them by the excessive capacity of their nuclear plants. Northern Illinois, 1993, $1.3 billion with a B dollar refund. We need internet organizations that are ad hoc. You want to buy a refrigerator, you should be able to join an ad hoc buying group so you get the information and maybe you even negotiate a better price, because large number of consumers can negotiate a better price. We need internet groups to handle complaints. Wouldn't it be nice if you had complaint handling this way? I think Ausbank has a complaint mechanism. Isn't it a big relief when you have a serious complaint? I mean, I get in the mail all kinds of people with copies of letters not answered, invoices, just to go to one group that has the skill and the know-how and cannot be turned off by the vendor. We need also, and this is really critical, we need higher expectations by consumers. If these companies lower your expectations, they can control you. When I started going after General Motors, every time a friend of mine or an acquaintance would be killed or injured in the car, poor handling, they never focused on the highway. They focused entirely on the driver. Well, if you only focus on the driver as the cause of all crashes, there is no pressure at all, is there? No pressure at all to get safer cars and better highways, safer highways. So if we raise our expectation level by spending some more time on what we buy, when we buy, how we buy, when we don't buy, we create the pressure, we create the interest to join consumer groups, to band together in all kinds of ways on all kinds of injuries. I can't emphasize more the importance of expectation levels that come from being more demanding. People are more demanding now against smokers, smoking in their area. They're more demanding about auto companies recalling defective cars. See what happens when people's expectations. We did a book called Women Pay More, because in our country, women pay more. Pay more for dry cleaning. They pay more, they often have more unnecessary operations. That's changing because there are no more women now as doctors. They certainly paid more for credit before we got the Equal Credit Opportunity Law through. It was incredible the way they would, the banks would charge women more. And we also try to have checklists, consumer checklists. People are busy, so they say, I'm going to buy a car, I'm going to buy auto insurance. Where do I go? Here's what I have to look for to save money, get a better deal, and have less aggravation. This is the Worst Pills, Best Pills publication. It's online. This is a real lifesaver that I mentioned earlier on our health research group. And this is even an easier website to remember. It's called worstpills.org. That's all you got to do. Worstpills.org. You subscribe, and then whether you're for your parents or your cousins or your children, anytime you are given a medicine, you look it up, and it's been a great lifesaver. I'm going to stop right now, so maybe we can have a little discussion. I want to thank Ausbank for bringing us all together. I wish there were more of us. You go back and tell your friends, you know, tell them what they missed, and get them out. The only way democracy thrives is when people show up. Showing up is half of democracy. Marches, demonstrations, look what the Occupy people did. There never was more than 250,000 total in the entire United States last fall, marching, demonstrating, or living in the encampments. Look what they did, just 250,000 people, and except for the encampments, very part-time. A march here, a demonstration there. It's all about having a higher estimate of our own significance, because with strong consumer power, you get better technologies, you get lives saved, you get trillions of dollars saved, you get less aggravation, you get less anxiety. It's good all the way around. But we have to have, to get that, a consumer sovereign economy, not a seller sovereign economy. Thank you.